Hello and welcome, everyone. This is our first instance of weekly conversations, unscripted conversations with coaches and experts on emotional intelligence. And today I have my two guests, Michele Nevarez, author of Beyond Emotional Intelligence, and Lynn Friesth, who is the Encore Career Coach, the Silver Entrepreneur Coach. And yeah, tell us a little bit more about yourself. So Michele, let's start with you. What has been your motivation to go with beyond AI, beyond emotional intelligence?
Love it. Thank you, Tony, for having us today. It's my pleasure to be here. And I just want to mention that also today is the Tibetan New Year. So,
Oh, Happy
Losotdashi
New Year!
Year of the Water Tiger. So my motivation, on some levels, kind of straightforward, which is just to benefit beings and to
Mhm.
be able to enact those things within myself and to help others do the same that they have some influence over in real terms. And so, my path, whether it's, been through the Buddhism and the practice that I have engaged in for the better part of my life, since I was 20. I'm now not 20. And 25 years in corporate spaces. And then the last six, starting these programs that both of you have gone through and participated in, has really been taking the wisdom of what we understand about emotional intelligence and the brain and asking that question of how can we be more skillful with all of our perceptions, where emotional intelligence is the baseline.
Thanks, Michele. And Lynn, what has been your motivation? Why the Silver Entrepreneur? Why the Encore Career?
Well, after a 40-year career in the corporate world, I did want to do something else, and I certainly wasn't ready to retire. So, as my wife said, I repurposed myself. But I became very curious about, what could you do as a company of one, especially making that transition from the corporate life, and then from a broader sense, we have all heard about the Great Resignation, the fact that we can't find enough workers, and demographically, that's true, at least in the U.S.
Mhm.
So my thought was, how can I help people who are maybe on the sidelines now after a long working life, but would still like to participate? Can I give them the skills, the knowledge, the tools that it would allow them to contribute further? Because in some ways, we may be living to 90 or even 100 years. So, you know, sitting on the sidelines starting at 65, is not good for either us or for society. So that's kind of
Mhm.
my motivation.
Yeah, I think there's such a need for this. It's great that you're out there doing what you're doing. So we all met at the Goldman AI coaching program, a program that you created, Michele, or co-created with Dan Goldman, one of the gurus of emotional intelligence. And and now I think there is a bit of a departure from the traditional emotional intelligence. What we understand about emotions has changed.
Yeah,
We
true.
we used to think about it as something that was innate, that coming from evolution, and the classical view of emotions. There are five categories of emotion: fear, disgust, sadness, anger, and joy, and then all the variations, nuances of it, and that they can translate into facial expressions that we all share. That was
Mhm.
the work of Paul Ekman and other people in that area. And
Yeah,
now there is another take in neuroscience that tells us, wait a minute, that classical view could be wrong. And
yeah,
emotions maybe are not innate like we think they are. They could be constructed. Maybe it's a own construction. Maybe we teach people emotions, and that's a totally different take on it. That takes us to a different direction, and that's the direction you're taking with Beyond the Eye, Michele, I believe.
yeah, that's true. And I have to tell you, it's been a little bit of a mind blowing journey all around, right? I mean,
Mhm.
to work with your professional hero and learn so much from Dan and everybody who went through our programs over the years that we did them, and we'll be doing them again this year now, the outer conditions permitting.
Mhm.
But during that time, um, everything that we built ultimately led to where we're at right now, including, the understanding of how emotion is actually more constructed than
Mm-hmm.
anything else, and that the brain functions on a predictive basis as opposed to a purely, stimulus, reaction based model where our thoughts or feelings are being triggered, but more it's the brain is simulating and taking its best guess of what's going to happen next, drawing on our prior experiences, and
Mm-hmm.
then in turn our expectations, right? And so that's a really different value proposition when it comes to what it takes to be emotionally intelligent and what we have to work with. And so some of the guiding questions that inspired our work for both the program you guys experienced and the work we're doing now was this question of what's that smallest common denominator of what we have influence over within ourselves
Mm-hmm.
intrinsically, irrespective of context.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I wanted to know. And I wanted to know, what are the prerequisites to doing any of the 4 domains and 12 competencies within the Goleman-Boyatzis model
Mm-hmm.
that we're all mostly familiar with,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because this is what we've been trained on. Um, and I wanted to know, so that's a lot to do well. How do
Mm-hmm.
we do,
Mm-hmm.
the things that are going to drive our ability to be inspirational, to be more empathetic and compassionate? What do we have available? And so just by asking that question of what do we have influence over led to really the bulk of my work that I write about in the book that I just
Mm-hmm.
wrote
Mm-hmm.
and was released recently by Wiley Publishing. But Lisa Feldman Barrett's work has really been a game changer. And I am just so grateful that I picked up her book finally and read
Mm-hmm.
it.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
read it, you know, really kind of just prior to writing the book. And I'm glad I did, because it really enabled me to embrace the new thinking relative to the constructed nature of
Mm-hmm.
emotions, right? And what is
Mm-hmm.
that role that learned behavior and behavior that we've observed has an influence on, how we make sense of,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
our emotions and our perceptions.
Yeah, something that comes to mind as you're saying all this, and it's been my experience with not just with emotional intelligence, but a lot of other domains like mindfulness and so on, that it's very easy to talk about it, to learn academically. Okay, I know what emotions are. I know about the 4 domains, the 12 competencies. I can talk about it at the
Yeah.
dinner party with everybody else. But are you really doing it? And that's the hard part, is to actually really do it,
Mhm.
to show those skills like day in and day out. And I think that's where you're going, being disappointed with the other models, like that they don't really hit it on the nail on the head, but you want to hit the nail on the head. And that's how you came up with the 12 discoveries. You want people to really realize what's going on inside, what they have control over, and where um, they actually can make a difference.
Totally. Yeah, Tony, I mean, it's so true. And, I think that the 4 domains and 12 competencies is a brilliant map of what it looks like when a lot of things are done well. But to your point, how do we do them?
Hmm.
And so I've done my best, taken my best attempt at formulating, looking at the latest neuroscience, both in cognitive behavioral science and in neuroscience and mindfulness, right?
Hmm.
What do we have direct influence on? And what are those practices? And so I think it comes down really, and I write about this in the book, as you know, because you read it. Um, it comes down to, in my opinion, our awareness that is the most fundamental thing we each carry
Hmm.
with us. We forget about it, but it's there. We forget about it because it's the vehicle that allows us to perceive. And so, if something is, in fact, also a tool or the ground from which we experience everything, it's easy to not see that thing. In the same
Hmm.
way that when we perceive, whether it's outer objects or even inner phenomena like uh, thoughts, feelings, memories that don't have a physical form, but we still experience them, it's easy to miss the fact that it's unfolding right there, and we don't necessarily see the mechanisms behind what makes that possible. So when we train in our ability to notice what's already present, what's already happening, as a means of shifting our, what I like to call perceptual stance, or perspective is one way to think about it, that changes the trajectory of the meaning we make and then the responses we take. So conscious sense making becomes part of what we have access to in real terms, that and shifting our own awareness. That's what I believe anyway.
Yeah, something that I believe is really helpful for people to understand is that when you go out there and you're told, okay, be aware of your emotions. Okay, you start looking at yourself. Okay, how do I feel now? And give them a name, maybe, which is very helpful. They become a concept, and you realize what's going on. But the problem with this is like, as you become aware of your emotions and your habits, you may feel bad about it. There's the emotions coming up of disappointment, maybe even of disgust and so on, because you didn't know you were like that you behave like that. Judgment comes in. So it's very important, and I think that's where mindfulness comes in, is that as you expand your field of awareness and observe who you are and how you behave, you need to do it with a non-judgmental attitude, because otherwise you're not going to be able to go very far.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into, the territory of, you mentioned the 12 self-discoveries, which, emerged well before our programs, actually, and out of my work, working in corporate environments in different industries for 25 years. What I noticed as I was coaching people, and then just in myself too, were these themes that kept coming up of where people get stuck mentally, mental habits, their thinking, their beliefs, how they're habitually perceiving and making sense of, what's happening in their lives, to your point, and maybe attributing it a meaning that's not actually very conducive, that's not helpful. And so, to your point, being able to shine the spotlight of attention, which is our awareness, onto the dynamics that we would normally not think to pay attention to, allows us to become aware of what's informing, or that root cause of, why maybe we can't change a habit or behavior, or why it's difficult. And so the 12 self-discoveries, which I write about and I speak of from the angle of what we understand about them from a science basis, as well as a coaching and a mindfulness, standpoint, are just tools. They're cognitive reminders of how we want to be, what does our best look like. So that's the inspiration behind the work anyway. Yeah.
And Lynn, we're talking about habits and so on, and how does that play for the silver entrepreneur, for someone who is about to reboot their life?
Well, and that's it's true. And actually, recently I was involved in a conference where one of the people proposed that we've defined the age of adolescence, which wasn't a real thing until somebody defined it in the early 1900s. And now maybe we should be defining a middlescence. In other words, people are facing some transitions in midlife, just as young people face transitions as they move into adulthood. So that whole idea, the one thing that might be different now is that we've got more entrenched habits, I'll say. We've had perspectives that have been with us for a longer period of time. But I think that's what's so interesting here, is to the extent that we can change our attention, our point of focus, all of a sudden then we can free ourselves from some of these, I'll say, learned behaviors, learned perceptions that we had. And again, I think this idea of constructed emotions is useful because we tend to think of these things as fixed, when in fact, even within ourselves, if we spend some time in reflection and say, well, this activity made me angry many times in the past, but now it doesn't seem to make me angry. I wonder why that is. Well, that's the opportunity to say, okay, what changed? And it may be, I look at this view differently. It could be, I look at this situation differently than I did a few years ago. Sometimes as we get a few years under our belt, some of the things that used to greatly upset us, we don't worry so much about anymore. So that's a positive thing. On the other hand, there could be other things where we're resistant to change. The world has changed, and things that we may have perceived as a threat or something that's wrong in the past may not be that way anymore. So, but this whole idea of constructed emotions, I think, is very valuable at all ages, but certainly for those of us that are facing transitions in midlife and beyond, and facing transitions going forward. We're going to have longer lives, so we're going to see more transitions than maybe our parents or grandparents did, simply because we'll be around longer. So how do we best prepare ourselves to do those things? And I think that's where Michele's work, and especially I've always enjoyed the 12 self-discoveries, because those are some key questions that you can practically ask yourself, write about, contemplate, and it does. It will shift your thinking, as Michele says, whether we have habits of action such as eating, but we also have habits of thinking. And the fact that we can shift our habits of thinking can be very valuable at any age.
Beautiful.
Wonderful. You talked about perspectives, changing the perspective, about the focus. What are we focusing on? And that's one of the 12 discoveries, Michele. Your reality is your focus, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean, and why is that important?
Yeah. So there is so much to that particular self-discovery. It's very rich. So on one level, one layer of meaning is that quite literally, whatever captures our attention is in that moment our reality. And if our attention or awareness narrows and fixates, then that is what we're experiencing. And there are feedback loops always anyway with perception. And so our thoughts and narratives about what we're focusing on have an opportunity to flourish, for better or for worse, right? If we're, for example, perseverating on something that didn't go well, or ruminating or thinking again and again, and it sort of comes back like the lyrics of a song you can't get out of your head, but in a way that's not conducive to a positive mental state or how you want to be showing up, then it's helpful, isn't it, to be able to let go. It's helpful to have had a bit of training where you're not stuck, or at least you see you're stuck, and can have the intention to reposition what you're focused on and widen back out, because our awareness has already natural qualities to it. And if we can start to familiarize ourselves with some of those qualities, like the spaciousness, right? Isn't it true that one of the reasons we can experience anything whatsoever is because of that spacious quality? Multiple things can exist at once and come up. We can have thoughts, we can have feelings, we can have sensations, we can be perceiving what's happening in our context. A lot of things happening at once, right? And so this self-discovery of understanding that you have options and possibilities relative to how you place, hold, refocus, redirect your attention. That's super powerful. That's a superpower that we each have, right? So
and that's something we use in coaching, right? We work with a client, we can see that they're focusing on one thing and they can see only that. And we try to open the perspective, like you were saying, Lynn. And I think also it opens the way to why do we ask people to practice gratitude, for example. Is when we are really focused on what ails us, the problems that we have, that's all that exists. And we can see that and nothing else. But as soon as we open it up and we think, oh, wait a minute, I still have a job, I still have a house, I have food on the table, and then we think about all this, and then suddenly that sort of gratitude towards what we have is changing the picture. Then we're not so unhappy anymore, and we change our emotion, we change the way we felt. And I want to go back a little bit to the basics, like emotions. What is an emotion? How
Well,
do we know it's an emotion and not a thought or something, some other mind activity?
well, you know what? It depends on the perspective that you're asking that question from. So I'll answer from a few different perspectives. The first one, let's just tackle it from a neuroscience standpoint, or the best of what we understand anyway. So, and again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm doing my best to understand the thinking that's out there. And, if you want to delve deeper into the topic, I'd highly, highly recommend Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, How Emotions Are Made. And then I think 7.5 Habits About the Brain, if I'm not mistaken. So affect is thought to be a precursor to instances of emotion. And affect is kind of a fancy way of talking about the valence, which is just whether we feel attracted to something and want more of it, or we feel repulsed by something, we don't like it, and
Mm-hmm.
we want to distance ourselves. But also sometimes things are just neutral, right? So they don't
Mm-hmm.
hold a lot of salience or strength for us. But when something does, our brain has predicted, you know, taken its best guess of how it thinks it's going to need to show up in the next moment based on prior experiences, right? It's kind of the statistical learning capacity of the brain that's incredible. And then it sets into motion a whole chain of interoceptive uh, sensations and affect as messages from us to us so we can do something with it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that every instance of sensation or affect becomes an instance of emotion. It does sometimes, and we assign it meaning, right? And that's a
Mm-hmm.
cognitive component of this equation, and that highlights that we can't really separate rational from emotion, right? Which is kind
Mm-hmm.
of an old idea that we've inherited from
Mm-hmm.
centuries of thinking about
Mm-hmm.
the brain, and how the rational mind is, oh, much better than the baser emotional mind. That's
Mm-hmm.
just folly. That's myth,
Yeah.
it turns out. Yeah. So, in any event, emotion in that context, at a most basic level, are those interoceptive sensations, the valence or strength, if we like something, dislike it, and how much. And then it becomes an instance of emotion that we assign concept to, which we get where? From what we learn over the course of a lifetime and the
Mm-hmm.
different contexts we're in. So,
Mm-hmm.
to Lynn's point that he was making, we can at least sort of cognitively in those moments say, wait a minute, is the sense my brain has curated for me, is it helpful? Or do I need to reframe or, uh, reposition my own thoughts relative to what's just happened? What would be more conducive for the relationship? What
Mm-hmm.
would be taking a step in the direction of the other person, for example?
Mm-hmm.
And then, relative to practice, in terms of meditation practice and just familiarizing oneself or becoming aware of mental movement in the mind stream, at least in the tradition that I've practiced within Tibetan Buddhism, we don't distinguish so much between emotions and thoughts. It's just mental movement, and it's temporary.
Mm-hmm.
It's moving through us if we let it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I guess that would be, the two layers of the response.
Interesting. So I'm gonna try to put that in layman's terms that I can
Please
understand.
do. Please, please do.
So
I
we
need
got we
that.
got this thing we call the interoceptive network, and basically that's something in us that tells us that something has changed in our body. There is a change. It can be a sensation. So maybe I touch something that's very hot. I burn myself. I get a sensation. The interoceptive network tells me, hey, be careful. There's something going on there. And emotions are kind of the same thing. The interoceptive network feels that there is a difference, could be in our body, it could be somewhere else, but usually we feel it like in our guts, in our heart, maybe in our head, but something has changed. Maybe we feel harder, our heart is beating faster. There's a little change like this that's caught up by the interoceptive network. And that's the beginning of the emotion, the affect, if I get it. And then after that, there is like the what you call the valence and the salience. So the valence is like, oh, I don't like that, or oh, I love it. And so if your heart is beating faster because you're going to the doctor, and you don't know what the news is going to be, that's probably, I don't like that. But if your heart is beating faster because you're just talking to the love of your life, then you really enjoy it, right? So that's the same thing, but totally different outcomes.
Yeah.
That's where the balance is. And the other one is the salience, which is the intensity.
Yeah.
So I have an emotion, and it could be like, well, yeah, I kind of don't like it, but I don't care. Or it could
Yeah.
be, oh wow, never, or I absolutely want it. And that's the salience, the intensity of the emotion. And once we have all that, the constructed part is like, um, where we go from there. So the body giving us information, sending different chemicals in the brain and so on, that's one thing. But where we go with that is another thing. And that's the part that we learn. So when we were little kids, we had our parents or the people around us telling us, oh, you are angry, you are sad, and so on. And that's how we learn emotions, and then we put names on that. Something very interesting in the books of from Lisa Friedman Barrett, she said that Tahitians, for example, don't know about sadness. There is no word for sadness in Tahitian, so if you go to Tahiti, you'll never be sad. They still feel something. They feel discouraged, they feel tired, there's something like this going on. They can feel something in their body, but it doesn't translate into sadness. So sadness is an invention that we created and that we all agree with. We agree that sadness is what it is, we call it. And that's what, that's basically what a constructed emotion is. And most of our emotions, if not all of them, are constructed.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Tony,
it
that
those, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say that brings to mind sort of a inter- interesting example that years ago was listening to a presenter on literally on a videotape. But one of the things he said was similar to what we're talking about. He used different words, but he said, okay, I'm going to bite into a lemon here. And he did. He bit into a lemon, made a, and then he said, did each of you feel that? Did you feel a sourness in your mouth? And everybody could, oh yeah, we kind of did. He says, but you actually didn't bite a lemon.
Mm-hmm.
So but your mind said that when you witness that kind of an event, this is the bodily sensation you might feel. So I think, again, that's one of those interesting things in life that um, our body can construct some things that actually don't happen. And I think, again, you get back into your the 12 self discoveries is you don't want to believe everything you think in some cases.
Mm-hmm. So very interesting what you're saying about, I think it has to do with the mirror neurons. We see something and we can, we do the action inside. So we can guess what's happening with the other person. But the danger now that we know with constructed emotion, which differs from the classical view, is that we could be wrong. In the classical view, everybody has the same facial expression when they have disgust or fear or sadness. With the constructed emotion, it's not true. You could see someone experiencing something. Your mirror neurons is going to tell you, like, okay, do the same thing, the same face inside, and then, oh, that's sadness. That person is sad. But you could be wrong. And so that's why empathy is very important. And most of the time, it's probably going to be right because we've all been trained the same way, watching the same movies on TV, the same kind of education. So we kind of make the same faces when we experience sadness, anger, or whatever. But there's always that possibility that you could be wrong.
And that every instance of emotion is subtly different, right? Think about all the
Mm-hmm.
different times you've experienced joy or sadness or any shade in between, and those individual experiences are so rich and contextual and unique, and not necessarily, to your point, according to having a unique signature or some kind of biological marker, right, which is coming out of really the work of Darwin, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wanted to mention that I've picked up a new book by one of my favorite authors, Leonard Mlodinow. He inspired a lot of my own work and journey, starting with many, many years ago, books that I've read of his. But his latest book, which I'd highly, highly recommend, is called Emotional.
Hmm.
And he looks at, the new findings in neuroscience from a historical perspective of where our notions, our learned notions about the brain and emotion emerged from, right? The thinkers and the philosophical movements and, the scientific uh, research of various time frames. And so I've been having a lot of fun reading that and unlearning, as I like to call it. We have a lot to unlearn, but equal opportunity um, to gain wisdom in a practical way that brings us closer to each other and closer to ourselves.
Mm, beautiful. To go back to the mirror neurons, that's another way to learn emotions. It's not that we are taught, you know, always with words. This is your emotion, and this is how you behave when you experience this, and so on in different situations. A lot of it is by imitation. Um, I remember like uh, spending time with my dad, for example, and a lot of weekends he would work on his car, fixing the car, and I would be the little helper, like holding the tools and everything else. But
Yeah,
when something went wrong, that he could not fix it or it didn't work, he would experience what we call anger, and probably like hit the car with a tool or do something like this that was totally stupid when you think of it. That doesn't make any difference, but that's how he expressed anger. That registered in my brain. My mirror neurons were like, wow, firing up. Okay, he's my dad, very important person in my life. That's how he experienced anger. And then I realized years later I was kind of doing the same thing. When something didn't work, I had to bang it somehow, like, because that's how I learned. And
mhm,
that's that. And I didn't learn that specifically with words. Okay, that's how you do when you are angry. It's just
exactly.
the mirror neurons, like learning by imitation. And
Yeah.
like
Or
for
even
all
just
of
your
us,
senses, right? Of what
yeah,
you
yeah,
observe. Yeah,
yeah, all of us practically uh, react the same way when we are driving and there is a reckless driver in front of us. I mean, not all of us, but many of us react the same way, and we start. We have that road rage, and then we probably like say something that we may regret later, some kind of insult. We may flip a finger, whatever we do, but we react with that sort of anger and gesture. But that's something we've learned not at school, like sitting down. Okay, that's how you react when you have a bad driver. Something we watch people doing, and we just do the same thing.
Mhm.
And so, how much of our emotions are like that by imitation from watching movies on TV,
yeah.
from
So much.
from the people we observe around us?
So much. And especially, Lisa Feldman Barrett writes about in the absence of experience of a particular thing, we're apt to look around and see how others around us are behaving, to your point, So this last week was my son's, they have a February break because in Massachusetts it's really cold and I guess we need to get away. So we drove to Baltimore to my boyfriend's parents' home, and they have a very nice home, and he's a judge, and there's a lot of formality, and we're really casual at our house. And so my son Dylan, who's 16, was really, like on his best behavior, and we were sitting down for a formal dinner, and I noticed it was so cute. It was so precious, actually. I had my hands kind of just folded like this so that my elbows weren't on the table, and it was just my natural posture. And I caught out of the corner of my eye him doing the same thing. And he was looking at me and he was going like this. And I just thought, oh. But to your point, right? And we don't tend to think about these things as learned. We rather tend to think about these as our truth, right? So because
Mhm,
we perceive
mhm,
something, there's this what's called affective realism, this view that we all have that what we perceive must be so, and our interpretation of it must be true, when really it's quite subjective, it's quite contextual, right? It's
mhm,
not as solid or real as we think. And so that idea alone helps us, you know, when we're really attached to something, whether it's anger in the moment or a point of view, we can release it a little bit. We can let it go, release, and not cling so tightly.
Yeah, I think that has to do, also with that what we learn without knowing it translate into emotions, and we have a tendency to really, what I would call, identify with our emotions, thinking that's us.
Yeah.
So when we talk with someone, we have those conversations, and I think a lot of people have experienced that, having a conversation with a family member or someone else who have different political views, especially those last years. And when you go in there, you try to reason. So that we all know that we can reason. We can, with thoughts, there's kind of like a playing field where we can go and we can argue, we can discuss, and we can exchange thoughts. We can change our mind. We can add to where we were thinking, it's very malleable. And we go into this conversation thinking that being rational and using our thoughts is going to do the trick. We're going to convince someone that our views is better than theirs, or they're going to convince us maybe. But when we go in there, it's so charged with emotions, and we so identify with those emotions that it ends up like in almost like a cat fight. Like if there is no thinking rational and going there, it's more I'm right, you're wrong, and the facts and everything else, and how we are able to unknowingly lie to ourselves and to others because we believe so much in those feelings inside. I mean, all those stories about facts that are not true, and on both sides. I mean, it's not one side or whatever. It doesn't matter, and I see that all the time with myself and with others. When I have a strong emotions and I'm convinced of something, I'm very likely to bring up facts that I don't really know about, and lie to myself so I can lie to others. And I think that's a very important point in our life when we want integrity, we want honesty and everything else, is to be able to realize the power of our emotions and what it does to us inside.
Well, it reminds me of confirmation bias, which is sort of the unconscious version of that, which is, I think, where many of us are caught a lot of the time, where we're either unknowingly looking for evidence to support what we already believe, or shaping the facts to fit what we believe, and that's kind of more the example you gave.
I think too, in a little bit different context, I spent a lot of years in labor relations. So yeah,
Wow.
obviously different people were advocating for different opinions or positions. And one of the things I always tried to hold was, could I stay curious about what the other person was saying for a little bit longer before I made a judgment? And and in fact, I often, as in coaching, when people are said they need to help dealing with a difficult person, which could even be a spouse or something. But in any case, I've always suggested try to stay curious as long as you can, because one, you'll find out more about their position that you might shut down if you just assume it's wrong. But those are the things where, again, I think, similar to the 12 self-discoveries, that curiosity is a key thing as far as helping us, get better at some of these things that are traditionally emotion charged. Not that we can't or shouldn't have emotions, but just being curious about what the other person's saying a little bit longer. And the other thought that occurred to me as you guys were speaking there was that, well, one of the great gifts that Michele and the whole EICC program gave to me was the opportunity to work with people from many different cultures. And in our work together, all of a sudden you got to see some very different perspectives, how people thought about the same thing. We were looking at the same thing, but they brought some very rich and very different perspectives from their culture. And, just as we've talked about, these are probably learned perspectives that each of us have. So it's, but those are the things that are kind of interesting, that it throws you off your certainty wagon, I guess, when suddenly you're in a conversation and people are describing something very differently than you would have from your experience.
Nice.
That
Yeah,
kind
great.
of brings me back to what you were talking about before, Michelle, which is the predictive mind. And I think what you're talking about here, Lynn, is like the faculty to get past the predictive mind and to go what we could call that the adaptive mind, the one
Mhm.
that's
Beautiful.
curious, that wants to know more. And I think that there's a relationship also to the makeup of the brain, right? If we look at the brain itself in neuroscience, there's kind of a default network, low energy, where we tend to stay. That's probably where most of the predictions occur. Like it's easy to predict, and that's our reality. But then to go to the place where we are really curious, where we are susceptible to include new information that will change our mind, the
Yeah.
adaptive place requires more energy, and it's harder to get there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true, Tony. You've described in layperson's terms what I try to accomplish with what I call the awareness matrix, and that was
Hmm.
my best attempt to look at what we have the capacity to be consciously aware of.
Mm.
And the zone you described that's metabolically efficient is what I like to call the habitual or passive perceptive mode, where we're responding to cues both in our environment according to the context without having to expend a lot of conscious energy or intentionality, right? And so the invitation, I think, is to, if we really want to have agency in our lives, to be able to, first of all, know those moments where we would do well to have agency or skill, and those are usually kind of, it turns out, the more difficult moments where we're kind of knocked off our game, or something
Hmm.
disturbs our regular response sequence to cues. And then what, right? How are we going to react? And so I think it's having an awareness of just how the basics work. And I think, one of the definitions that has ironically been left out of what it means to be emotionally intelligent is to understand the best of what we know about how emotions work in the brain and the body.
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
got to be part of the equation. We don't have to be experts, but we need to know enough. We need to know
Hmm.
enough to know what our tricks are, to know when we're up to our
Hmm.
old tricks, to be able to shift gears and really have influence on our outcomes.
Yeah. My understanding is that the environment, our body, wants to save energy in case we get attacked by a tiger or something, whatever it is. It wants to save energy most of the time. So we don't have access to that part of the brain we're talking about. We're mostly in the predictive brain, which means that we pretty much live our life in a semi state of sleep,
I like to
more or
say
less.
zombie, like
Zombie, the
zombie
zombie
mode.
state. Yeah, the zombie state. And because we have all those habits, routines, we do everything. We get dressed. We don't get to the office in PJs, but all that is based on routines. And a test that I like to do for myself and for other people is to say, what do you exactly remember about yesterday or one random day of last week? And what happens all the time is that instead of remembering what happened vividly, we go to our logical mind. Oh, I had to go to
I
work, so
must
I
have
had to
done it.
get up. I had to put on some clothes, so I had to, and piece by piece you reconstruct your day. But how many vivid memories did you have from that day?
It's a great point.
When we are beyond the predictive and in the adaptive mind, we create new pathways. New neurons are firing up together, and there is a lot of work going on to recreate something new, and that creates vivid memories as well. So when we remember something and it's vivid in our mind, chances are that our adaptive mind was at work. That's how I I describe this like
I
the
love it.
experience of those two different brands. So the zombie state that we are most of the time in is our body saving energy, but also everything around us. Nothing around us wants us to be more aware, to create new pathways and so on. The watching the tube, the smartphones, all the social media, and even the people around us don't want us to change most of the time. So everything is kind of against us, like changing. So when we say we have a growth mindset and we want to change and we want to learn emotional intelligence and becoming more emotionally intelligent, it's hard work. It's not
It is.
easy.
It is, but oh, go ahead, Lynn.
I
You
was
speak
just going to
first.
say, we in the last 2 years we've just experienced one of these what I'll call the great unfreezing moments. So all of our habits of work, life, and everything were very disrupted, and a lot of us have been, off our game too. Or as we're now into a couple of years, we've maybe adopted some new habits. But it also, I think, that leads to this the great resignation. People now all of a sudden they stepped away from their habitual ways of living and thinking, okay, I'm going to think about this a little different now, and maybe what I've been doing wasn't what I wanted to be doing. So, it's one of those things that they're disruptive. On the other hand, they're sources of great opportunity. So, but that unfreezing is very disorienting to any of us, because all of the habits we had that kept us moving in a particular direction, good or bad, all of a sudden are not working anymore. And so it's, you use a lot of energy. And I think a lot of people did in this, how do I homeschool my children? How do I work from home? How do I stay connected with my, those kinds of things. We all had to figure them out, and that was hard.
I totally agree with you, Lynn. I think so many rich examples that you gave. And in fact, I was chuckling a little bit. I saw a post this morning, Tony, that you commented on, of Arianna Huffington's, where she did a quick poll of the Great Resignation, and she listed, I think, 3 or 4 choices of what people want more of, and they were all mostly around, do you want to work from home? Do you want to see, well-being policy put in place? And again, this is not a one-for-one. This is my memory of it. And I remember thinking, yes, and how about alignment of purpose? How about alignment of values and meaning, and working for companies that are agents of world benefit? So I put my 2 cents in. But, Lynn, just kind of this point of, like all, I think, habit change where we have an inertia, there are certain inflection points that either happen, outside of us or even inside of us, or personal circumstances. Sometimes we call them crucible moments. But I think the pandemic was one of those inflection points that caused us to look at what we had been doing a little bit differently, right? And Tony, the only other thing I was going to say is that when you look at within that soup of all that is delivered to us by our predictive brain, as you put it, I like it. What do we have influence over? And so this thing we can think of as conscious awareness that we always have with us, it's there, it's available. We just need to remember it. We just don't have the habit of remembering it. And when we do, there's this other kind of awareness called open awareness that is less effortful and just natural. And we don't have to force things as much, is the point I was going to make.
We got about 10 minutes left, and before we leave, I want to just go back to reality and talk about what's going on right now for most people. You talked about the pandemic, Lynn, and how that affected a lot of people, and today there is the war on Ukraine, and that's affecting a lot of people. I think, at least the way I experience it, is there's certainly some anger, some sadness, but the biggest one is probably disappointment. I'm so disappointed that in this day and age, where we are all connected with the internet, with social media, that something like this can happen. That politics and the failure of diplomacy can lead to killing people who are innocent, who have nothing to do with what's going on. And so I think disappointment is one of my emotions, and I know other people feel the same way. Or it could be anger, or it could be sadness. How do we deal with those emotions?
Mhm. Yeah, great questions. I mean, I have my point of view, Lynn. I'd love to hear your point of view too.
Well, I think of some of this. Again, can we be curious? Because I think on the other extreme is what we often have seen here is uh, demonizing other people when we don't really know them, and but and in effect, we don't look at them as people; they're demons at this point, you know. And so this idea, can I be curious about what are the needs, the wants, the desires, the perspectives of these other people for on whatever side it is, you know. I have no idea what the perspectives of Vladimir Putin are, you know, but there's some reason he's doing what he's doing. I may not agree with it, I may not like it, uh, but he has some reason to do it. And I had a friend and teacher said that, you know, whoever you're facing, whatever they're doing makes sense to them at the time. It may not make sense to you, it may not make sense in any values you hold, but I mean, some people are truly irrational, but you know, by and large, most people are trying to do something that makes sense to them. I may not understand it, but I think that's part of what we have to keep working on in the world. And I think of that I go back to stuff I've read before from it was the Harvard Negotiation Project, and they did a bunch of books, Getting to Yes, Beyond Reason, but they dealt with this idea of how do we talk about intractable uh, disagreements in terms of most of theirs was international or business related, but you know those ideas of how can we you know talk about things where we are very different in opinion. And now I think you know Michele, you bring it back to even more basic. You know, how do we think about emotions because that ties into all this stuff, and how do we even think about changing our perspectives and things like that. So I don't know, Michele, maybe I can't speak for you, but I'm sure you have some great ideas on this.
And before you do that,
Oh,
Michele, I just want to rephrase a little bit. I say, how do you deal with those emotions? But I don't mean how not to feel. I think I want to feel those emotions. It feels right to feel uh, disappointed, disgusted, sad, angry in this case.
Mhm.
But what I really mean is, what can I learn from those emotions in a
mm,
constructive way?
Mhm.
yeah. So I had in mind three levels of response to your question, three methods, okay, that you can work with any emotion. First of all, understanding emotion is temporary. It is a signal to us, by us, for a reason. And so there is the sensory based, right? We can, as we were talking about before, be aware of the bodily sensations. The do I like it? Do I not? What's its strength? And I just observing curiously and non-judgmentally, what is that? And and that would be sort of a sensory based approach. When it comes to the assignment of meaning or making sense of, which our brain also curates us for us, mostly on a preconscious basis, we can look at what's been curated and say, does this make sense, or do I need to reframe what we think of as
Mhm.
recategorizing the senses, like you described before, that our heart can beat, and it could be because we're nervous or because we're in love, but we have some volition there about how we make sense of things or remake sense of things. That's one. And two, there is that cognitive element of, like I mentioned, reframing our meaning. So we can take something that's inherently quite complex and challenging, and to Lynn's point, work with our point of view and how we're making sense of things for the purpose of being able to see things that we don't see quite so clearly
Mhm.
in one
Mhm.
point of view. And then that gets to really the third level, which is awareness itself, because any kind of mental movement, thought, including emotion, is temporary. It's kind of like energy. And we can allow it to come and go. We can, to your point, Tony, feel it if we feel that that's where we need to be. Like nobody's saying push it away, suppress, because it's there anyway. So even if you do that, it's going to take its course because it's energy. So, and then finally, there's a non-conceptual way, which is to just be able to notice the awareness and the ground with which it's all appearing anyway. It's what's allowing us to experience. And so we can just by resting in our own awareness of what's unfolding, take a non-conceptual approach, which helps it dissipate if that's what we want to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you were saying that what crossed my mind is what do I have control over? What can I actually control? There is the fact that this is going on in the world, and I know I cannot change these people's mind. There isn't much I can do. On the small level, I can help. I can talk about it, and I can participate in some events that will help the people and so on. But I think more importantly, it brings me to the point where emotions are a lot like sensations. Like you get sensation that something is wrong with your body, and suddenly you realize, you just stepped on something and it hurts or whatever. But then something has to change.
Yes.
There's a need for reaction somewhere. So
That's
when we
right.
feel that way about something happening in the world, it tells us there is a need for a change. There is a need for a reaction. We may be to that point where we feel like we are too small to make a difference, so it's not under our control. But then it's not true if we have a lot of people together deciding that we can't have that anymore. And I think that's why it's important to honor those emotions, see what we can learn from them, so that when there is an opportunity, we're going to be there.
Beautiful.
We're going to be there and act on what we need to act on.
I couldn't agree more.
I think of Mother Teresa. She was not ever able to solve poverty in India, but she could affect positively the people she could interact with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it's one of those things that we do what we can do, and and hopefully push things, nudge the universe slightly in the right way. But even though we can't direct the universe to our way of thinking.
Yeah.
So we're about at time. Any last words? Any words of wisdom you want to share?
It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and again, my mind has been stretched. It can't go back to the way it was before now. So I want to thank both of you.
Yes, thank you, Tony, for having us, and thank you, Lynn. Always great examples, and mainly it's been fun and an honor. And I think what I want to say is just for anybody tuning in, I think just congratulations on growing your own capacity and opening new possibilities for yourself to pull on.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to thank you. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Michele. Thank you so much for being in this conversation and for playing the game with me. Like, being, it's unscripted, it's wholehearted, it's who we are, that's what we think about. And I want to thank also the attendees, the people who take time off their work or the things that they had to do to listen to us. And if you're interested, I posted in the comments the Michele's book, if you want to acquire the book, and also the websites for Lynn's podcast on the Silver Entrepreneur, the Encore career, as well as my own website, and the website also for Beyond AI, where a lot is happening right now. A lot of new things. And so thank you again for being with us today, and join us again next week. It's going to be different people, but same spirit and same unscripted conversations from the heart.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Michele.
Thank you.